The Christchurch Call to action. World leaders and tech firms pledge to work together to eliminate violent content online. But the US says the plan threatens free speech and won't endorse it. So, will this campaign work? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Foli Batibo. The worst attack in New Zealand's history has sparked a global pledge to fight violent content online. 51 people were killed in March when a gunman opened fire at two mosques in the city of Christchurch. The shooting was streamed live on Facebook, which was criticised for failing to stop the spread of the video. 2 months on, New Zealand is leading what's being described as the Christchurch Call to combat hate speech and violent content on the internet. Social media firms and 18 governments have signed on, but the US is refusing to endorse it, saying the campaign threatens free speech. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, Natasha Butler has this report from Paris.
At the Elysee Palace, the French president and New Zealand's prime minister hosted a summit aimed at encouraging governments and tech giants to crack down on violence and hate speech online. Representatives of internet companies, including Facebook, Twitter and Google, and world leaders signed a pledge called the Christchurch Call. The pledge to better regulate online content was named after the city where a gunman killed 51 Muslim worshippers in March and live-streamed the massacre on Facebook.
Notre objectif était simple.
Our objective was simple, that what happened in Christchurch should never happen again. It was not merely an unacceptable terrorist attack, but a transformation of the internet into a machine aiming to destroy any form of cohesion in our society.
Ardern said Facebook had already responded to the pledge by announcing it would limit live stream access for some users. She also said tech company officials promised to do more to remove violent posts, impose new standards and review the way in which users are directed to content online.
Never before have countries and tech companies come together in the wake of a horrific attack to commit to an action plan that will deliver collaboratively work and new technology built to make our communities ultimately safer.
18 governments signed the pledge, but not the United States. White House officials said it would curb free speech.
The decision by Washington not to sign up to the pledge will no doubt be disappointing for Ardern and Macron. Nevertheless, they will hope that this summit leads to better international regulation of online content. But the pledge is non-binding. It leaves enforcement and the setting of rules up to the goodwill and motivation of tech bosses and political leaders.
This internet expert says it's not only companies and governments that must act more responsibly, but also individuals.
We've all witnessed online harassment, violence, racism, so it's up to people not to share this content and act by reporting it. As for companies, they've got algorithms so they can target negative content and should favour positive content.
The Christchurch Call highlights growing frustration amongst governments and citizens with the relatively unfettered online powers of tech companies. Ardern is campaigning for what she calls a humane internet, and not one that fosters real and devastating violence. Natasha Butler, AlJazeera, Paris.
Now, as we mentioned, governments around the world and tech firms have committed to ensuring that effective counter-terrorism laws are in place and that measures are taken to remove what they describe as extremist content online. To do this, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Twitter and Microsoft say they will implement 9 steps. This includes updating their rules to stop the distribution of violent content and introducing new restrictions for live streaming. But the Christchurch Call says any action taken should not violate fundamental human rights, including freedom of expression. Well, let's bring in our guests now for today's show. Joining us on Skype from Stuttgart in Germany, Eoin Lenihan, a researcher on online extremism. In Oslo, Bjorn Eiler, a specialist on violent extremism and a survivor of a shooting attack in Norway in 2011. And from Cork in Ireland, also on Skype, Balkan, a digital rights activist and author of the Ethical Design Manifesto. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being on Inside Story. Eoin, if I can start with you, what do you make of this pledge by government leaders and tech companies? Is this a good first step to tackling online extremism?
I think it's a hugely inspirational document, aspirational. I think it's correct that world leaders are asking tech companies to step up to their social responsibilities. I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to implement this, and we do have something of a precedent here in Germany where net laws came into effect in January of this year against hate speech, and companies such as Facebook can be fined up to 50 million euros if they don't remove posts. And already we're seeing similar discussions here as we're bound to see around free speech with this move.
Bjorn Eiler in Oslo, your thoughts. Governments and tech companies coming together, is this a good thing? Will these guidelines, in your view, eventually lead to a better regulating the internet?
I think it's definitely a good move and a good show of intent that tech companies and governments are coming together. I think they have come together many years ago and have been working on this in kind of less overt ways. Google started against violent extremism back in 2011 as their effort to counter violent extremism themselves, as one of the tech giants who brought together survivors, former extremists, governments, and tech companies. So this is an effort that's been going on for quite some time, including with the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which brings together a lot of the tech companies as well. I think one of the weaknesses here is the same weakness we've had in the field of countering violent extremism as always, that violent extremism itself is not very clearly defined. And so there is a good show of intent that we want to counter violent extremism in itself, but we need to know what it is that we want to counter in order for that not to be abused, in order to limit freedom of expression and other human rights.
It is very interesting that you make that point. Balkan in Cork, before we get to this issue of free speech and free expression that the United States has raised, I just want to get your thoughts on what was pledged in Paris. I mean, as Bjorn said there have been previous attempts to regulate online content in the past. Do you think a globally coordinated effort can really work? Every country, after all, has its own approach, national tradition. Can a global effort, is this realistic?
I personally don't think that we're talking about the right things here. I mean, I read the Christchurch Call. There is a lot in there that's not just about the technology, but about addressing the social issues that lead to violent forms of extremism and to extremism, and those are very welcome. I think when it comes to technology, what I'm seeing is that they don't necessarily understand the technology. Now, we're calling for a more humane internet. By definition, that's not a corporate internet. And yet we're risking here entrenching this system that we currently have, which Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, these tech giants that we keep talking about. We are at risk of entrenching the system that they've created as the only internet. We use them interchangeably. We conflate Google and Facebook with the internet, and more dangerously, with the potential of what the internet could be if it wasn't tied to their very short-sighted corporate agendas. I don't think we're talking about the right things. We're not talking about the kind of alternatives we could have where these issues would necessarily not be issues to begin with.
But should it not start with these big companies, though? Shouldn't it start with Google and Facebook, because they are the big ones, after all?
Well, we should definitely be regulating them. But regulation doesn't necessarily mean inviting them to the table. It doesn't necessarily mean co-regulation, which is what we're seeing with Macron in France, for example, and Facebook, because that could very easily mean, for example, the government of France or other governments getting access to the data and the algorithms and the platforms of these companies, which they could then use for other purposes, for example, censorship, for example, for surveillance, because these companies are surveillance companies to begin with. And, in my view, the only thing more dangerous than these corporations having all of this information is a government with an army and a police force attached privileged having all of this information. In my view, it is us as individuals that should have ownership and control of our own data, and data about the world should belong to all of us in the commons, but we're not talking about these things.
All right. Eoin, do you agree with Arol's view there that, if you want to regulate online content, you shouldn't necessarily invite these big giants like Facebook and Google to the table, and that individuals should have a bigger say in how it's regulated?
I think we have to deal with what's in front of us. And right now, Facebook, Twitter in particular, they have, he's correct, they have unbelievable power to influence public opinion, even elections and so on. So I absolutely agree that is a direction maybe we have to evolve towards. But right now, I think we have to deal with what's in front of us. And I do have concerns with Facebook and Twitter being at the table here. I think that we're at an all-time low in levels of trust with these two companies, particularly as alluded to, their Facebook's handling of data information. And so I think it's going to be a very, very hard sell, especially in the United States. I think we're quite polarized across the West in most countries, but in the United States in particular, I think it's going to be a very hard sell where we do have a right to free speech enshrined, where conversations around these are often highly toxic, for want of a better word. And I think also another issue here is where this idea is seen to be coming from. I can already see that there's mention of their Second Amendment rights in the United States with guns. We have Jacinta Hearn, who's presenting this motion, who famously banned assault rifles in New Zealand less than a month after the Christchurch attacks. And we're going to see a lot of this get tangled up in First and Second Amendment squabbling.
But let me, Bjorn, do you think the U.S. concerns are legitimate? The U.S. has said it won't join this call because of concerns over free speech protection. Is this a legitimate concern in your view?
I think it is a legitimate concern. I think the U.S. Has chosen other places to ignore human rights in the battle against terrorism and violent extremism in the past. So I don't know whether I trust how genuine the concern is from their side, but it is a legitimate concern to be concerned over essentially pledges or legislation that is de facto limiting what you can say under a very vague definition of what violent extremism is. We've seen several times in other parts of the world, among others in Turkey, that the term violent extremism, the term terrorist, is being used against political opposition, and that's deeply problematic, and one of the reasons why human rights is something that needs to be preserved and needs to be part of the conversations also within the tech giants in these conversations. And I know for a fact that Facebook, Twitter, and Google are having very serious conversations about the implications of their policies when it comes to removing violent content, because it's also very difficult to tell from a moderator's perspective as well as from an artificial intelligence moderator's perspective or machine moderator's perspective whether something is a terrorist attack or whether something is terrorist propaganda or whether it's documentation of abuse from abusive government, for instance.
Yeah.
And so it's very important that those companies are present in those conversations and also present in the conversations about human rights. And they are all taking part in conferences and forums on that. They are all present at the UNGA. They're all present at the Oslo Freedom Forum that's taking place in a couple of weeks. And so I'm very happy to invite those companies to take part in the conversations that we're having in the civil society sphere, in the policy sphere, to really kind of open up the dialogue about what we mean by violent extremism, what do we mean by the deletion policies, how do we preserve the values that we want to preserve against violent extremism without going down the route of using the means violent extremists are using against the rest of the world by denying people human rights.
Arol, your thoughts on this particular point, the point that there's a difficulty to define what legitimate free speech is, what legitimate expression of radical ideas is, and when it actually tips over into something more sinister like terrorism. And do you also think that the U.S. concerns are legitimate? Is it a genuine concern that the Americans have made about this?
Well, I think we can all agree that the Trump administration never does anything for the right reasons. This is an administration that's called the free press the enemy of the people. So please don't lecture us about free speech. You're the last people to be doing that right now. But yes, the concerns about free speech are legitimate, but they start way before. What we have lost on the corporate internet today is the public sphere. So we look at these platforms like Facebook and Google, and we think that they are parks. They're not. They're shopping malls. So we already have lost a great amount of freedom of speech on these platforms, because the only freedom of speech you have on a commercial platform, just like in a mall, is what the proprietor of that platform allows you to have. So I guess the questions we need to ask ourselves is, do we want them to be better censors? Do we want them to be better filters of our reality? Or is it time to start regulating them, of course, breaking them up, making them pay taxes like big tobacco? Why aren't we talking about these things? Reducing their harms as much as possible, of course, but also we need to invest in ethical alternatives that are owned and controlled by civil society, by individuals, alternatives that lead to a healthy commons, a healthier environment to begin
unfortunately, we're not quite
but
there
we're never
yet.
going
So
to get there unless we start talking
whose
about
responsibility is it then at this stage? Is it the government? I mean, the European Union has tried to do this. They've proposed laws to fight against extremism online that require platforms, for instance, to take down any terrorism-related content within an hour of a notice being issued, or the company risks a fine. Can this European model be applied elsewhere on the global stage?
Well, I think what we need to do is we need to separate these tech giants and regulate them separately, and be very clear that our regulation is for these centralized data harvesting companies, so that we don't by accident also destroy the potential of a decentralized internet. Because we can build technology differently. We can build it so that we have privacy and we can have freedom of speech. So imagine, for example, that every one of us had our own place on the internet that we owned and controlled, that people could find us using a domain name, for example. Let's make domain names non-commercial. Let's make it so that everyone can get a domain name for free. Let's subsidize web space so that people can have their own spaces. Let's build platforms that are end-to-end encrypted so we can privately talk to one another. Let's start incentivizing these things and make sure that the regulations we have to curb the harms of the centralized tech giants today don't in any way hinder the potential of a free and open and decentralized internet in the future, because that's the real danger that I see here.
All right, Eoin, your thoughts on what Aral has just said.
Just to return to this idea of a viable model, I do believe that this German model that we have here would most likely be a blueprint for whatever will take effect from all of this, if there is anything enforced or brought into law from this. But just on that, I think, again, to go back to this idea of free speech, it is the heart of all of this. And just as an example, here in Germany already, we've had several cases where people have ran afoul of this new law. One of them being Titanic Satirical Magazine, which put out tweets mocking the head of the AfD here in Germany, who were writing actually tweets in her voice, and they actually got banned. It was taken down under these laws. So we're going to have a lot of issues like this. I think they've made a clear commitment to working on artificial intelligence, which again, I don't see that we're there yet. We don't have any form of artificial moderation that seems to work. A second issue, I think, here with free speech is what are our basic definitions?
Right.
I think that what is extremism? What is terrorism? And so I talk about low trust, and one of the key things when we have these two massive players, Twitter and Facebook, at the table, and like I say, they're very polarizing figures. There's a lot of toxicity on their platforms, and their users are quite polarized also. I think that one of the issues we're going to have here is what is extremism? And up until recently, now they've parted company, a lot of the figures of extremists on these platforms were supplied by the SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Centre, and the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, which have been accused of being political themselves.
Right.
And so that's going to be an issue. How do we define these and how do we separate those definitions from
Let
politics?
me ask Bjorn about what he thinks specifically about that. Bjorn, some would say that the mainstream social network have become more aggressive about removing, for instance, pro-ISIL content from the average user's feed, but that far-right extremism and white nationalism continue to thrive on some of these platforms. How do you explain this? I mean, has there been too much focus, you think, on radical, so-called radical Islam and not enough on far-right extremism?
So I think there's been a lot more focus on Islamist extremism, also in the terms of their content. It's been easier, if you like, for kind of Western companies, Western governments to define Islamist extremism as something that is bad, while far-right extremism kind of fringes on what is happening in the mainstream political sphere right now. And so the distinctions between far-right extremism in Western Europe, the US, etc., and what's happening in the mainstream political sphere is getting blurred, and so it becomes very difficult to remove far-right content without necessarily also removing content that might be from people who exist within the political sphere. And so then it becomes then it starts bordering on censorship of the political discourse, which is tricky. I think what's needed to be done is essentially to try to define more clearly what the values we want our societies to embrace, and to clearly define those in a way where we don't accept ideologies that don't accept the universality of human rights. And so my definition of violent extremism has always been those who do not accept the universality of human rights. One way of dealing with that is saying that those people who speak out against the freedom of others on the basis of their origins or their religions, etc., those are infringing on that, and they are in breach with violent extremism. And so we need those definitions, and we need to understand where we want to stand, but also these big tech platforms need to clearly define where they stand, and kind of define what is acceptable within the realm of that discourse, what falls within political discourse and what falls outside of it. Another kind of way of approaching that is to not necessarily define it as something that should be censored directly, but something that should be prioritized differently in the sorting algorithms that are behind the feeds that you see online. Something that we can essentially design the platforms to not necessarily promote in the same way as we are right now. Right now, we are having these online platforms. We're having Twitter, we're having YouTube, we're having Facebook, etc., that are promoting the content that is driving the most reactions. And so the most outrageous content is the content that gets the most attention.
Right.
And that happens to be largely things that fringes on violent extremist content as well. So it becomes a really kind of difficult conversation to have about what are the priorities of the companies, what are the priorities of us as a society, and how do we best can mitigate the threats of violent extremism without also infringing on freedom of expression and the freedom to have a political discourse with diversity.
Okay. I'll give you the last word because we're running out of time. You've told us about some of the ways that we could regulate online hate speech, but what do you say to those who say that we're fighting a losing battle here? And what do you think the top priority should be for governments? I know you don't believe that tech companies should be on the table, but what should governments do as a top priority right now?
Well, we are fighting a losing battle. And the reason we're fighting a losing battle is because we have a total failure of imagination. We're being reactive and only reactive. Our policymakers don't understand the technology and don't understand what's possible with the technology. These big tech giants are at the table, but who's not at the table? We're not. I'm not. Our not-for-profit that's trying to create decentralized ethical technologies is not at the table. Why aren't we at the table? Why aren't we taking part in these conversations? So Jacinda, if you're listening, I'm more than happy to help. Why aren't you asking us to help? So what can we do? We can stop and we can start to think differently. We have a climate emergency right now. We have a habitat loss emergency. And what we also have is a personhood emergency and a loss of our commons and our public sphere emergency. So I think what we need to do is stop being reactionary, stop with business as usual, and try to imagine a future in which we're not limited to an internet that's owned and controlled by a handful of Western corporations.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you, gentlemen, for a very interesting discussion. Eoin, Lenihan, Bjorn, Isla, and Aral Balkan, thank you very much. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at AlJazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation, of course, on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Fuli Batibo, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.